we started back up in the book of Kings after several weeks off. And so you'll remember, the book of Kings is kind of this ongoing story. First and Second Kings, like much of the Old Testament, is in our Bible as two books, but was originally written as one. And so we looked at it not as two different stories, but one complete tale. We're going to do the same thing with Chronicles today. It is separated into First and Second Chronicles, but originally as one piece of work that, because scroll length was a challenge, apparently, they had to cut in half. And so I'm not quite sure why scrolls had to be not long enough, but that's how it was. So we have First and Second Kings, and that's what we looked at last week. And that is kind of the recurring story of the kings of Israel failing. And we looked a lot at the similarities it had to other Old Testament stories and the cyclical relationship of the Israelites with God, where they would receive blessings, right, and they'd have all these good things happening because they were living in harmony with God. And as they received blessings, they'd get greedy, and they'd start to take advantage of those things, and then they would get conquered, either by themselves or by other people. We kind of talked about that as an amorphous word, just meaning they fall away from God and things start to go bad. A disease hits, a war breaks out, the economy crashes, something goes wrong. And then when that happens, they start praying to God and say, forgive us, we're so sorry, we were wrong, we're never going to do it again. This time, raise up another blesser and we'll be good, we promise. And so God listens to his people, and he raises up a new, better king in the hopes that they will do a better job, and the cycle starts again. And this is similar to what we saw in the book of Judges. Stepping back a few now, there would be a judge, and they'd say, this is how we live in harmony with God, and the people would do it, and they'd get blessings, and then they'd slowly stop doing it, and they'd be conquered, and then they'd go to God and say, please rise up another judge, we were so wrong, we'll never do it again, and that cycle continued through Judges. We see that again happening in Kings. So Kings is that story of kind of king after king after king failing. You'll remember in the end of 1 Kings, there's a civil war among the Israelites, and half become north, and the other half go to the south. Those become Jerusalem in the south and Judah in the north. And those two kind of get their histories told separately in 1 and 2 Kings. And you'll remember the author jumps back and forth between the two, telling you how terrible all those kings were. And we talked about how the author had a grade book for each king, and in the north, none of the 20 that he explored were good kings based on his criteria. And in the south, 8 of the 20 got a good king grade. And of course, in the end, it ends with the exile of both kingdoms. The north is conquered by Assyria. They come in from the north, conquer the northern tribes, and disperse them into their empire. And the southern kingdom gets invaded from Babylon, is destroyed, and sent into exile. And that starts what we call the Babylonian exile, or Babylonian captivity. And we talked a little bit about why exile matters, not just in the story of the Israelites, but in our story. It's symbolic of our personal exiles, those moments where we're separated from God. Right? The Israelites are separated from their home, they're separated from God in the most literal sense possible. But that speaks to the way in which we, as Christians today, still isolate ourselves from God and find ourselves in exile. So, you would think, based on the Old Testament we've read thus far, that we would naturally flow into the story of the Israelites in Babylon. You'll remember 2 Kings ends with one of the kings of Babylon taking a king in the line of David and bringing him to his royal court, letting him feast and treating him like royalty. We talked about how that's just a little glimmer of hope for the Israelites. They're still oppressed, they're still enslaved in Babylon, but their king is being treated like a king again, even though he doesn't have an empire. And throughout the Old Testament, we've just kind of been following the chronological story of these people. But if you've read the Bible straight through before, you might know that now we hit 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Again, one story that's been divided in two, and it does not follow the chronology. It feels really weird, and if you've read it before in the context of the books around it, you might have had some questions about what it's doing and why it's there. The first challenge that we get is that it doesn't follow the chronology in the same way. It recaps the story of the Israelites and is written after they're released from Babylonian captivity. So it skips this big chunk of time where they're captured in Babylon and goes right back to where they're in Israel. The temple has been rebuilt, the kingdom has been restored. Things still aren't going well, but a lot of time has passed and it's just dropped right here. The other confusing thing about Chronicles is that it offers this following the genealogy of Adam through the reign of David and his kingship to the Babylonian exile. So it starts by saying the exile is done, and then retells you the story of how they get to exile. And it's weird because you've just read that story. So why, 8 chapters into the Bible, do I need to reread everything that I just read? Well, originally, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or Chronicles, as they would have been known then, were not where they are in the English Bible. Originally, they were the very last book of the Hebrew Scriptures. This is what you read last in the chronology of the story. It's not clear necessarily why it got moved in the English translations of the Bible, but it got moved and dropped kind of into this place. And so it is confusing, and people tend to skip it because it just feels like a recap of what we've already read. And so you hit Chronicles and you go, don't need to read that, let's move on to Ezra and Nehemiah. But the theology that we find in Chronicles is really important and really profound. What Chronicles does is sees that even after the exile is done, even after the temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, things are not going the way the Israelites had hoped they would go. They believed passionately that once they were removed from exile and rebuilt the kingdom of God in the promised land, that messianic king that they had been promised for so long would finally come back. So if we can build the second temple, get ourselves right with God again, rebuild this kingdom, then the Messiah will come, and all nations will be ruled by God from Jerusalem, from our kingdom. And now, hundreds of years later, that still hasn't happened. We understand the history of Judaism, certainly, and Christianity as well, to be thousands of years long. But for these early Israelites and for the early Christians, the idea that the Messiah would come felt like it was supposed to be imminent. Had you asked early Jewish writers when the Messiah would come, they wouldn't have told you 1,000 years from now. They said, probably within my lifetime. The Christians in the early days were the same. If you had asked one of the early disciples, one of the early apostles, when will Jesus come back, they would have said, within my lifetime. It's going to happen immediately. We get to look back and say, well, 2,000 years are gone and we're still not back. So you were wrong, but they thought that it was imminent. And that imminency plays a role in Chronicles because the Jewish people are disappointed by the fact that it was not this imminent rise of the Messianic king to change the world which they lived in, but this continual struggle to survive in what is a very harsh land, geopolitically and naturally. So it's not a story that we should skip because it gives us some insight, and Chronicles really lays the groundwork for the Gospels and for the story of the New Testament. And that's weird because it's kind of smack dab in the middle of the Old Testament in our modern Bibles. But it sets the idea of what this Messianic king is going to look like, what they might do, what we might expect, and tries to offer hope to those discouraged Israelites that it is coming, and when it does, it will be powerful and transformative, and it really sets the stage for the Gospels. So we're going to dive in to Chronicles today. Okay? Let's open first to the beginning. Chapter 1 just kind of gives some context to who the author likely was. Like I said, we don't know who this person was, but based on the opening lines of the book, we get an idea that this person lived hundreds of years after the exile, because things have returned to normal a little bit in Israel. And so if you look at 1st Chronicles, well, the first 9 chapters are all genealogy. Let's start there. So if you open to the very first chapter, you just see names. And that's another reason a lot of people go, not reading that. I mean, that first paragraph, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Malalal, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Noah's family, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. A lot of pages of names is not very fun. And we kind of go, why did Old Testament authors go through the trouble of writing out these vast genealogies? What is the point of spending 9 chapters of your book telling me that this guy begot that guy, begot these kids, begot those kids, had these cousins, lived next to that guy on this street in that town? Why does all of that matter? In 1st Chronicles, it matters because the author is retelling the story of the Bible and focusing on 2 main lines. He's focusing on the lineage of David, the king that we talked about in the book of Samuel. Remember, David is the king that first unifies the Israelites. He's that powerful, kind of idolized king of what Israel could be, even though he has his own fall from grace. But his rise happens with the battle of David versus Goliath, and he takes the throne, and he's a great king, and he unifies the tribes. So the author is reminding people of David, and he's also following the genealogy of the priesthood. There's a lot of other genealogies in here, but these are his focuses, David and the priesthood. And what he's trying to remind people of is that we have this long line of kings, of which the Messiah will come. So let's track through those, hit the highlights, and tell you about all the great things that have happened. It reminds people of the priesthood, these people who have chosen to give their lives and their families to the worship of God, and they come out of the line of Aaron. Right? So these first 9 chapters just go on and on and on with names. And we're not going to read them, because they go on and on and on and on with names. So if you don't want to read all the names in Chronicles, but you still want to read the book, my advice is you jump straight to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is where we actually get a piece of the story. And this is where we get the indication that the author is not writing chronologically after the end of Kings, because it says here in 9:1, Judah was carried into exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. The first to resettle their property in their towns were the Israelite people, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. Those settling in Jerusalem included some from Judah, some from Benjamin, and some from Ephraim and Manasseh. So the author is saying Jews were exiled from Jerusalem. The first to resettle after the exile was done is this group of people. This is where they settled. This is not how they got back, per se, but kind of setting the stage that they do get back. And then he goes back. So we're kind of jumping around a little bit in Chronicles, and it gets a little confusing, but that's okay. So the Israelites are gone, and then they're back. The exile has ended for the author, but he decides to go back and retell the story, starting in chapter 10 with the story of Saul. The story of Saul for us started back in 1st and 2nd Samuel, those books where we read about the rise and the fall of Samuel, the rise and the fall of Saul, and the rise and the fall of David. So Saul is the king before David. Okay? And if you remember back to 1st and 2nd Samuel, Saul dies a really gruesome death with his sons in a battle, and the author recounts that almost verbatim here in chapter 10. When the Philistines attacked the Israelites ran away from the Philistines, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The battle was fierce around Saul, and when the archers located him, he trembled in fear. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me with it. Otherwise these uncircumcised men will come and kill me or torture me." But his armor-bearer refused because he was terrified. So Saul took the sword and impaled himself on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also impaled himself on a sword and died with Saul. So Saul and his 3 sons died. His whole household died together. When all the Israelites who were in the valley saw that the army had run away and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. So the Philistines came to live in them. So as he starts to tell this story, we don't hear anything good about Saul. And that's different from 1st and 2nd Samuel, which shows how Saul comes to power and the fact that Saul at one point was a good king for the Israelites. In this, we've skipped all of that. The section before kind of goes through Saul's genealogy, but it starts with his death. And it's an embarrassing death for Israel, right? It's not just that the king died, but the army got obliterated by their enemies. And so this story in Chronicles starts at a really low point, right? Saul and his family dies. The entire tribe is embarrassed, and things are not looking good. But the author does that intentionally because he's working us up to King David and then David's son and his reign as king. So if you turn to chapter 11, we see the rise of King David. Again, it's different, right? This retelling of the story does not include the story of David and Goliath or David wandering around in the wilderness being hunted by Saul. It jumps to Saul's death and then straight to David being king. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But in chapter 11, we read that all the Israelites gathered around David at Hebron. "We are your own flesh and blood," they said. "In the past, even when Saul ruled over us, you were the one who led Israel. The Lord your God told you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become a leader over my people Israel.' So all of Israel's elders came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them before the Lord. They anointed David to make him king over Israel, just as the Lord had promised through Samuel." So here the author puts more salt in the wound of Saul. And they say, even when Saul was king, you were really the leader, David. You are the guy we've been waiting for. you are who we want. You've been in charge for a long time, and now we get to put the crown on your head and really give you what you deserve. And so we come from Saul, and immediately David is placed up on this pedestal. And it doesn't give any backstory to why David is this beloved king of the Israelites. So if you are a ancient world person and you've not read 1st or 2nd Samuel, and you just pick up Chronicles, you don't know who David is, you just know that the Israelites really love him. He's just a great guy, and he's supposed to be king, and now he is king, and Saul was not very good, apparently, and he died, so progress is being made. So, weird details being left out in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so then, David becomes king, and he starts to build up his army, he starts to unify the tribe, and that all matches up with what we read in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And we can jump to 1st Chronicles 21, and we see this interesting story that's not in 1st or 2nd Samuel, where David receives instructions from God to build the temple. And in it, the story closely mirrors the story of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments in Exodus. God calls David to step away from where he is comfortable and go to this remote place. God speaks to him, giving him these commands about what he is supposed to do, hands him the instructions of what the temple is supposed to be, and there's this clear imagery created between David and Moses. David is the new Moses. David is the leader that God speaks to, and that's intentional. The author wants people to see David and think of Moses and think of this line of great leaders in the Israelite history in the same breath. So chapter 21, verse 15. Let me make sure that's the one I really want. Yeah, we'll start there. So early in chapter 21, David decides to take a census, and that makes God angry. God doesn't want them to take a census, so he sends a messenger to Jerusalem to destroy it. But just as the messenger was about to destroy it, the Lord looked and changed his mind about the destruction. He said to the messenger who was destroying it, "That's enough, withdraw your hand." At that time the Lord's messenger was standing near the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. When David looked up, he saw the Lord's messenger stationed between the earth and the sky, with a drawn sword in his hand stretched out against Jerusalem. Then David and the elders, dressed in mourning clothes, fell on their faces, and David said to God, "Wasn't it I who ordered the numbering of the people? I am the sinner, the one responsible for this evil. But these sheep, what have they done? Lord my God, turn your hand against me and my household, but spare your people from the plague." So before we even get to this imagery tying David to Moses, we get this almost Christ-like imagery from David. Right? He is taking responsibility for the sins that he has committed in the sins of Israel. He calls them his sheep. Right? And we see Jesus a lot in the Gospels talking about his followers as a flock, as sheep. And so as this starts to draw parallels to the Messianic king, we start to see that interwoven into the character of David. He's willing to sacrifice himself for the betterment of his followers, of his people, and of God's children. And again, that's an intentional literary action happening. That parallel is what the author wants us to start to see. Verse 18. The Lord's messenger ordered Gad to tell David that he should go up to the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite, in order to set up an altar for the Lord. So remember when God's talking to Moses, he says, "Go up on top of the mountain, build an altar so that I can come to you." Parallel here. So David went up, following the instructions Gad had delivered in the Lord's name. Ornan turned around and saw the king. His 4 sons who were with him hid themselves, but Ornan continued threshing wheat. When David approached Ornan, Ornan looked up, recognized David, left the threshing floor, and bowed to David with his face to the ground. David said to Ornan, "Give me the side of the threshing floor, charging me full price, so that I may build an altar to the Lord, and the plague among the people may come to an end." Ornan replied to David, "Take it for yourself, and may my master the king do what he thinks is best. I'll even provide the oxen for the entirely burned offerings, the threshing boards for wood, and the wheat for the grain offering. I'll provide everything." Ornan giving selflessly to David so that he can have this encounter with God. But King David said to Ornan, "No, I will buy them from you at a fair price. I won't offer to the Lord what belongs to you, nor offer an entirely burned offering that costs me nothing." Then David gave Ornan 600 shekels of gold by weight for the site. David built an altar there for the Lord and offered entirely burned offerings and well-being sacrifices. He called on the Lord, who answered him with fire from heaven on the altar of the entirely burned offering, consuming the entirely burned offering. Then the Lord commanded the messenger to return his sword to his sheath. At that time, after David saw that the Lord had answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he offered sacrifices there. And then in chapter 22, that first verse, then David said, "This is where the Lord God's temple will be, along with Israel's altar for entirely burned offerings." So in here we see lots of imagery back and forth, tying David to Moses in the way in which he's encountering God in the secluded place that God has led him to, and to this messianic figure. David is willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good of the community and his people. David refuses to take the property for free, and it chooses to pay for that so that it's his sacrifice, not the sacrifice of the farmer. And so there's this bridge being built from Moses to David to the Messiah. And that's exactly what the author wants the readers, these Israelites who are kind of down in the dumps, that things have not worked out, to see that there is this train moving. We've gone from Moses, who connected us to God, and David is rebuilding and strengthening that connection to God. And eventually in his line there's going to be this Messiah that takes us to a plane that we can't even imagine, trying to refire the hope among the Israelites. What's interesting in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as it talks about David, is that David never does anything wrong. And we know that that's not the story we're told in 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's the story of the rise and the fall of David. And that fall happens when he has his affair with Bathsheba and then kills her husband because he might find out. And so he sends her husband, one of his best soldiers, into battle and whispers in the general's ear, "When you go and attack, I want you guys to put him at the front, and then as he's running out, you all stop. That way he hits the bad guys first and gets killed." Right? And that's the beginning of David starting to fall away from God. That story doesn't happen in this book. Right? David's a dutiful husband. He never cheats on his wife. He never kills his friends. He never makes any mistakes. Because David is in the line of the Messianic king. He can't mess up. He has to be perfect. And we have to kind of rebrand David later in the story. The author of Chronicles is saying, we need to inspire these people. We need to give them a little bit of hope. So we're going to take these characters, we're going to smooth out the edges, make them a little bit better, a little more lovable, and hope that that inspires people to keep this fight going, to keep their faith in God. So David becomes this perfect example of what a messianic king looks like. Someone who is dutiful to God, someone who lives by this incredible code of ethics. David becomes the prototype. The author is essentially saying, this is who we're looking for when we start to search for our messianic king. Someone who looks and acts like David. That's what we want to see. The author doesn't stop there. There's some interesting things throughout Chronicles that become hyperbole in all likelihood. In chapter 24, I have stretched. It talks about the formation of Israel's military under David, and talks about how each division has 24,000 men, and there are 12 divisions in the Israelite army. And the quick math is that that's 250,000 soldiers in the ancient world. The idea that there were 250,000 soldiers in the ancient world and they routinely got their butts kicked by other empires is hyperbole, right? Again, we're expanding the story, making Israel bigger and grander, smoothing out those rough edges, and really trying to create hope in what was. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, David gives this really long and powerful speech to the leaders of Israel. He gets all the tribal leaders together, and he knows that there are divisions between them, but he also knows that there are things that unify them. So he gives this speech that we get in chapter 28. And so in verse 2, then King David stood up and said, "Listen to me, my relatives and my people. I wanted to build a temple as the permanent home for the chest containing the Lord's covenant, our God's footrest. But when I prepared to build it, God said to me, you must not build a temple for my name because you are a military man and you shed blood." And so again, David is saying, I've done wrong. I've got to take ownership for what we've done. Is David the only Israelite that has shed blood or conquered other territories? No. But he's putting that onus on himself. "The Lord, the God of Israel, chose me from my whole household to become king over Israel forever. He chose Judah as leader, and within Judah's family, my household, and among my father's family, he was pleased with me, making me king over all Israel. And from all the many sons the Lord has given me, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the Lord God's kingdom over Israel. He said to me, your son Solomon will build my temple and my courtyards, for I have chosen him to become my son, even as I myself will become his father." Some messianic language there. Solomon will be my son, I am his father. See the same parallels to Jesus. I'll establish his kingdom forever if he remains committed to keeping my commands and case laws as he does now. So now in the presence of all the Lord's assembly, and with God as our witness, carefully observe all the commands of the Lord your God, so that you may hold on to this good land and pass it on to your children forever. As for you, Solomon, my son, acknowledge your father's God and serve him with enthusiastic devotion, because the Lord searches every mind and understands the motive behind every thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you abandon him, he will reject you forever. Now then, since the Lord has chosen you to build a temple for him as a sanctuary, work hard. Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the entrance hall, its buildings, treasuries, upper and inner rooms, and the room for the cover. He provided all of the plans he had in mind. So again there we see some language tying David's line to the Messianic king. Solomon, who's going to be the next king, gets to be the son of God. God is his father, just like we hear God and Jesus talked about in the New Testament. We also see tiebacks again to Moses. If you look at chapter 28, verse 8, we see this line, so now in the presence of all the Lord's assembly, with God as our witness, carefully observe all the commands of the Lord your God, so that you may hold on to this good land and pass it on to your children forever. And if you can, with me, remember all the way back to Deuteronomy 11, 13, 21, we heard similar things being said by Moses when he was kind of giving his final farewell to the Israelites. Deuteronomy comes after Numbers. Numbers is that book where the Israelites are moving around, roaming in the desert for 40 years. And at the end of it, you'll remember that the first generation of Israelites is told they can't enter the Holy Land because they screwed up too much. God says to Moses, clearly you cannot handle this covenant. I parted an ocean for you, and the next day you started screwing up. Okay, you don't get the promised land. I'm sorry. Your second generation can go in, you guys don't. And so the Israelites get just outside the Holy Land, and they're just waiting for the old people to die so the second generation can go in. And Moses gives these final words to the second generation of the Israelites. It becomes central to the Jewish prayer rituals and to their understanding of God. And it's Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 21. And this is Moses talking. Now if you completely obey God's commandments that I am giving you right now, by loving the Lord your God and by serving him with all your heart and all your being, then you will provide rain for your land at the right time, early rain and late rain, so you can stock up your grain, wine, and oil. He will also make your fields lush for your livestock, and you will eat and be satisfied, but watch yourselves. Otherwise your heart might be led astray, so you stray away, serving other gods and worshiping them. Then the Lord's anger would burn against you. He will close the sky tight, there won't be any rain, and the ground won't yield any of its crops. You will quickly disappear off the wonderful land the Lord is giving to you. So Moses, in his final moments, in his final words, is saying, obey God, live in harmony with God, listen to God, remember what he has commanded you, and you will be blessed in this land that he has promised. And David, as he's preparing to give the reign to his son Solomon, is saying, obey God, listen to God, remember what he has commanded you, and we'll get to keep this land, and we'll be blessed in this land. So again, we see this chain being built. Moses to David, David to this Messiah. And it probably would have been sufficient for the author to keep David up on his pillar and say, that's what we're looking for in a king, let's move on. But he decides to take Solomon, David's son, to an even higher level. All right, so David does just about everything right, but Solomon just edges him out. And as we'll see and be reminded, that's not the story we get in Samuel. Again, Solomon, David's son, starts out pretty good, but in the other Old Testament stories we read, he has his own pitfalls. But just like 1 Chronicles ignores David's mistakes, affairs and murder, it ignores Solomon's mistakes, worshiping other gods in the temple, marrying hundreds of wives, enslaving Israel, those types of things, right? This book does not talk about those things. Solomon instead is put up on this pillar and treated like the best king Israel ever could have had. And that starts in 2 Chronicles. The very end of 1 Chronicles is David's death. And David's death is used to summarize David's reign in the very last verses. So 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 26 is this summary of David's reign. David, Jesse's son, was king over all Israel. He reigned over Israel for 40 years, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. He died at a good old age, having enjoyed a full life, wealth, and honor, and his son Solomon followed him as king. The account of King David from beginning to end is written in the records of Samuel the seer, Nathan the prophet, and Gad the visionary, including everything concerning his powerful rule and what happened to him, to Israel, and all the kingdoms and other lands. Lived to a good old age, enjoyed a full life, wealth, and honor, and his son Solomon followed his king. No mention of anything that David might have ever done wrong. He had the perfect full life, and the perfect full reign, and now his son gets to have the more perfect, more full life. And that's the chunk of 2 Chronicles that we'll look at first. So in 2 Chronicles verses chapter 1, we first encounter Solomon as king. And as soon as he is king, and this matches up with what we read in 1st and 2nd Samuel, Solomon begins to have these conversations with God. Solomon is one with God. He is close to God. And so chapter 1, verses 1 through 10 retell that story for us. Solomon, David's son, was securely established over his kingdom because the Lord his God was with him and made him very great. He's not just good, he is very great. Solomon summoned all Israel, including the officers of the army, the judges, and every Israelite leader who was the head of a family. And then Solomon, accompanied by the whole assembly, went to the shrine at Gibeon because that is where God's meeting tent was, the tent that the Lord's servant Moses had made in the wilderness. Now David had already brought God's chest from Kiriath-Jearim to the place where he had prepared for it because he had pitched a tent for the chest in Jerusalem. But the bronze altar that Bezalel, Uri's son and Hur's grandson, had made was there in front of the Lord's dwelling, so that is where Solomon and the assembly worshipped. Solomon went there to the bronze altar in the Lord's presence at the meeting tent and offered 1,000 entirely burned offerings upon it. That night, God appeared to Solomon and said, "Ask whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." This is Solomon replying. "You showed so much kindness to my father David," Solomon replied to God, "and you have made me king in his place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be fulfilled, because you have made me king over a people as numerous as the earth's dust. Give me wisdom and knowledge so I can lead this people, because no one can govern this great people of yours without your help." God says, okay, and what a good guy. God comes to Solomon and says, "What do you want? You get one free wish. I'm your genie tonight. What can I get you?" And Solomon, he's so perfect. He says, "How about wisdom and knowledge so that I can be the best king I can be? I don't need money or power or soldiers. No, God, not a big house or a Ferrari. I just want to be a great king for you and your people. Aren't I awesome?" Yeah, you know. Old world Ferrari was just a really nice horse.
I remember someone talking about that.
So again, we get this image of these kings being built up, and they're just so good, right? They're these great guys who are great rulers, and these Israelites are reading this going, why don't we have that? When do we get our David? When do we get our Solomon? And the author is trying to make the point that it's coming in the Messianic king, right? These guys are the prototype for what will come, and even they fall low. And so then in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 14 through 17, we get more of this story about Solomon, and he begins to acquire wealth. And again, this matches up with what we read in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Solomon is king at the beginning of his reign. He does a good job, and he is in relationship with God, and he follows God's command, and he gets really wealthy, and he gains lots of territory, and things go really well for Solomon. In 2 Chronicles chapter 2, we start to see Solomon preparing to build the temple. Remember, David gave him the plans that God had given him, so Solomon's job, Solomon's mission, is to fulfill the wish of his father and complete the temple of God so that he doesn't have to live in a tent that's hundreds of years old anymore. To build the temple, this palace for God's presence to live in, to be at the center of our community where we can all worship and be in connection to God. And this is very close to verbatim to what we see in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Solomon talks to kind of the kingdoms around Israel and says, "You and my dad knew each other really well, and you worked together. Do the same for me. Give me the wood I need, give me the silver I need, give me the gold I need. Let's start gathering these resources." So that continues. And chapters 2, 3, 4 just kind of talk about Solomon begins to build the temple and talks about how much it cost and how much gold he put in it and which rubies he put in it and how the construction workers did it. Chapter 4 talks about all the equipment that Solomon buys and builds to go inside of the temple. The bronze altar, the fancy chairs, the beautiful draperies, deep detail about what this temple To us today as Christians, that doesn't really mean much to us. We've never seen the temple, have no expectation that we will see a temple. But to these Israelites, this image of the first temple would have been really powerful, because they never got to see the temple of David's dreams. These later Israelites who have come back after the Babylonian exile don't get to see the original temple, because when the Babylonians come in, they burn it to the ground. They roll into Jerusalem, and this tower, or this temple that Solomon builds, gets destroyed. So these Israelites have never seen it, and this detailed description of what it would have been like, well, it would have been fun to read. It'd be like if we found out that there was a White House before the White House, and someone said, this is exactly what it looked like, isn't that cool? We'd go, oh yeah, that is really cool. Look at that history, look at that architecture, how neat. It's like the images of this church before the fire, like that old church that doesn't stand anymore, but the descriptions of it, the imagery of it is powerful and invokes all kinds of thoughts and emotions. The same thing is happening for them in these chapters. And so we read it, and that's a lot of conversation about what kind of chairs you put in the temple. I'm not sure that I need that. But to the audience that this is written for, these kind of down-in-the-dumps Israelites looking for hope, this imagery of what once was is incredibly powerful. So chapter 5 continues kind of talking about, in the first chunk, all the gold that goes into it. And then in chapter 5, starting in verse 2, Solomon dedicates the temple. Again, this is recapping what happens in those earlier books of the Old Testament. Solomon finishes the temple. He gets to do this big dedication for the temple that takes days and days, because he's really going to do his best. There's lots of sacrifices, there's lots of prayers, there's lots of celebrations, and the temple is completed. Now, in the books we read earlier, this is the point in Solomon's story where things started to go downhill. And so you'll remember that Solomon builds the temple, and then his greed takes over, and eventually he starts acting like Pharaoh. Remember? So in the other book, Solomon finishes the temple, and that's the end of his time being right with God. Up until that point, he has done everything that God has asked. He has stuck to the commandments. He's lived and walked with God just like his father was. And then he finishes the temple and says, okay, well, that's pretty cool. Now what? And he starts to take several wives. And we talked about that a few weeks ago. Why did he marry hundreds of women? Well, because in the ancient world, marriage was used for alliance building. So if the king of this little chunk here has a daughter, and I marry her, well, he's probably not going to invade me because his daughter lives in my house. And I'm not going to invade him because his daughter lives in my house, and she'll be very upset if I kill her father. So I'll marry her, and we'll become friends, and we can trade with each other, we can share resources with each other, we'll build an alliance. Solomon takes that idea, which is common practice in the ancient world, and just blows it up. And in those earlier texts, we read that he just has hundreds of wives and hundreds of second wives, and he's using all of them to build these alliances throughout the ancient world. But that's against the commandments that God has given, right? God says, and the priests say, you can't be marrying multiple women. That's bad. But that's not the worst that it gets. Solomon, because he marries so many women, begins to worship his other wives' gods. The daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt comes up, and okay, you can worship your God, but we're going to do it back in the hallway. Stay away from the temple. I'm going to keep worshiping God. 10 wives later, okay, I'll come to your church with you every now and again, but I'm still going to worship God. 100 wives later, okay, I'll worship all the gods. We'll do whatever we want. Eventually, Solomon takes things that were gods out of the temple and begins to worship false gods in the temple. And that's the big no-no. Remember, that's the first thing that catches the Israelites after they're freed. Moses goes up on the mountain and gets the 10 commandments and comes back down, and they're already worshiping the golden calf. What do you do? I was gone for 5 minutes. Where did you get this thing? Why are you worshiping it? Don't do that. Solomon falls into that trap of worshiping false gods and just declines quickly. And then he starts becoming like a Pharaoh. He's rich, he's powerful, he has all these alliances, and he wants to build lots of things, because that's what emperors did back then. They got rich and powerful, and they built big things that they could put their name on so that everyone knew how big and rich and powerful they were. But that requires people. And as a historian, I strongly believe that aliens did not build the pyramids, but slave labor built the pyramids. And Solomon followed that same idea. He enslaves even Israelites and forces them to build his building project, right? Big temples and palaces and estates that he's going to live in. And so quickly, Solomon becomes like Pharaoh, this guy that they escaped from in Egypt not that long ago in their history. So in the other texts of the Old Testament, Solomon's kind of demise and fall from God's grace is quick and pretty dramatic. He kind of becomes the main bad guy of the first two books of the Bible. It doesn't happen in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 2nd Chronicles chapter 8 verse 11 tells us who Solomon married. Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter from David's city to a palace he built for her because he said, "My wife mustn't live in the palace of Israel's King David because the places where the Lord's chest has been are holy." No hundreds of wives, no hundreds of second wives. He married King Pharaoh, gave her a different palace because she couldn't be close to God because she worshipped other gods. So not only does he not marry all these women, but he's so intent on worshiping God correctly that he builds her a new palace so that she's not too close to God's. Different from the story that we get in other sections of the Old Testament. But we do see that Solomon is prosperous and he builds a lot. You can see that in chapter 8. But a little bit earlier in chapter 7, we see again this meeting between Solomon and God. And so it's probably on the same page, 2nd Chronicles chapter 7 verses 12 through 18 that capture this encounter with Solomon. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon at night and said to him, "I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place as my house of sacrifice. When I close the sky so that there is no rain, or I order the locusts to consume the land, or I send a plague against my people, if my people who belong to me will humbly pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. From now on, my eyes will be open and my ears will pay attention to the prayers offered in this place. Because I have chosen this temple and declared it holy so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. And for you, if you will walk before me just as your father David did, doing all that I have commanded you, and keeping my regulations and case laws, then I will establish your royal throne, just as I promised your father David. You will never fail to have a successor ruling in Israel." So a lot happening in this conversation between God and Solomon. First, God is reiterating this promise that the temple is a special place. A place where his heart and his eyes are. A place where he hears the prayers of the Israelite people. Why does that matter? Because after the exile, the Israelites return to Jerusalem and build a second temple. The author's reminding them the temple is important. This is where God is. This is where he listens to us. This is where he connects to us in a very deep and powerful way. So though the Messianic King has not returned, don't forget that God is here and God is still ruling over us and God is still hearing and listening. That temple matters. Good on you for building a second one. Also, we get this promise to Solomon that he will never fail to have a successor ruling in Israel. Remember, the Messianic King is coming from the line of David. So there has to be a successor to Solomon who eventually is a Messianic King for that prophecy to come true. So for the Israelites reading this, waiting for that Messianic King, it's another reminder from the author, God promised Solomon and David that successor will always be on the throne. And eventually, that successor is going to be this Messianic King we've been looking for. So 2nd Chronicles continues and tracks Solomon's reign, and Solomon continues to do a great job. But eventually Solomon dies, and his son, Rehoboam, and I was wrong on that name last time we talked about him. I'm going to be wrong and say it about 50 different ways this time we talk about him, because it's a really hard name. And if any of you know the correct pronunciation, I'll let you say it, and I'll try to learn. But Solomon's son takes over. And remember, in this story, Solomon was just the perfect king. He did everything absolutely right. And so the hope would be that his son will do things perfectly too. This author ignored everything wrong that Solomon does, but does not give that same courtesy to his son. And in a way, that makes sense. The readers of this know that at some point things go horribly wrong for Israel. They know the story of the exile. They know the story of their civil war. So at some point the author has to pivot away from everything being perfect and sunshiny and show that things went wrong. And that starts here with Solomon's son. In Kings, which we talked about last week, it's Solomon's son who starts the civil war. And that story is retold almost verbatim here in 2nd Chronicles. So if you turn to 2nd Chronicles 12, I'm sorry, yeah, chapter 11. And we'll start in verse 3. So in Kings, you'll remember that the people were frustrated with the way that Solomon had ruled. And so they come to his son, who is now king, and says, we want you to treat us differently. That's not quite the story we get in Chronicles, because remember, Solomon never did anything wrong. So in Chronicles, the people are just mad. Not a lot of explanation about why they're mad, but they are. And so they come, and we can pick it up in chapter 3 of chapter 10. People sent and called for Jeroboam, who along with all Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our workload very heavy. If you will lessen the demands your father made of us and lighten the heavy workload he demanded from us, then we will serve you. He answered them, come back in 3 days, so the people left. King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon when he was alive, and asked, what do you advise? How should I respond to these people? The elders said, if you are kind to these people and try to please them by speaking gently with them, they will be your servants forever. But Rehoboam ignored their advice the elders gave him, and instead sought the counsel of young advisors who had grown up with him and now served him. What do you advise, he asked. How should we respond to these people who said to me, lighten the workload your father demanded from us? The young people who had grown up with Rehoboam said to him, this people said to you, your father made our workload very heavy, lighten it for us. Now this is what you should say to them. My baby finger is thicker than my father's waist, so if my father made your workload heavy, I'll make it even heavier. If my father disciplined you with whips, I'll do it with scorpions. And so he goes and he says this to the people. They don't like it, and this starts the civil war, right? The northern kingdom separates, the southern kingdom separates. Now in Kings, that second book of Kings jumps back and forth between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom's kings to kind of paint this picture of them throughout time. Chronicles doesn't care about the northern kingdom because it's focused on the genealogy of David. And we saw that at the very beginning of 1st Chronicles. It's talking about that genealogy of David, trying to get us to a messianic king. So the northern kingdom is not talked about in 2nd Chronicles. Focuses on the genealogy of the southern kingdom and all the horrible kings that come. So it's a lot like 2nd Kings in that. This bad king did this bad thing, this bad king did that bad thing. Israel keeps falling and falling and falling and falling, with the exception of a few. The author kind of picks out the few good kings and says this is why they were good. And the answer is that good kings obey God and live in harmony with his commands, right? And so the author is making very clearly the case that when kings and people obey God, good things happen to the Israelites. When we choose to obey our own desires and we ignore God, well then bad things happen. So this story gets played out just like it does in Kings. And there's a couple of prototypical kind of examples of that. One is in chapter 26, under the heading Uzziah rules Judah. And in chapter 26, verse 16, we get very clearly these lines. But as soon as he became powerful, he grew so arrogant that he acted corruptly. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God by entering the Lord's sanctuary to burn incense upon the incense altar. The priest, accompanied by 80 other of the Lord's courageous priests, went in after him and confronted King Uzziah. You have no right, Uzziah, he said, to burn incense to the Lord. That privilege belongs to the priests, Aaron's descendants who have been ordained to burn incense. Get out of this holy place because you have been unfaithful. The Lord God won't honor you for this. So again, as soon as he was powerful, he became arrogant, corrupt, and started to disobey God. He walked away from God. And that's kind of the prototypical bad king. They come to power, say, enough with God, I'm a king. I don't have to listen to that guy, and become corrupt and cruel and bring Israel further and further away from the commandments of God. There's a couple of exceptions in Chronicles. One is Hezekiah. Hezekiah comes to power and says, we've done a really bad job living with God's commandments. And Hezekiah comes into the story in chapter 29, but we're going to jump ahead to chapter 30, where we see the story of Hezekiah's Passover. Passover is an important Jewish holiday that is used to remember the night when they were in Egypt, when God passed over the households of Israel when he was cursing the children of Egypt. And remember, the story was you paint the goat's blood above your door jamb, and my spirit will pass over your house and go to the next one. So every year, Jewish people celebrate Passover remember being enslaved in Egypt and the way in which God freed them from that slavery. And that's an ancient tradition that Hezekiah is going to reinforce during his reign. He looks around and says, we've done a really bad job worshiping God, being connected to God, remembering God. So let's restart our faith by really focusing in on Passover. And sometimes we do the same thing. Not done a very good job with church this year. So starting on Easter, I'm really going to nail it. I'm going to come on Sunday, I'm going to do the Bible study, I'm going to try a lot harder. Now, starting on Christmas, this time we're going to get it. This is what Hezekiah is trying to do. You fell off the wagon, we're going to pick this day, we're going to get back on it. And so he gives this speech, because that's what kings do. They give speeches to the entire country. They had really good sound systems back then. So in chapter 30, verse 7, his speech starts. People of Israel, return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, so that he may return to those of you who remain, who have escaped the capture by the Assyrian kings. Don't be like your ancestors and relatives who were unfaithful to the Lord, the God of their ancestors, so that he made them an object of horror, as you can see for yourselves. So don't be stubborn like your ancestors. Surrender to the Lord. Come to God's sanctuary, which he has made holy forever, and serve the Lord your God, so that he won't be angry with you any longer. When you return to the Lord, your relatives and your children will receive mercy from their captors and be allowed to return to this land. The Lord your God is merciful and compassionate. He won't withdraw his presence from you if you return to him. So the runners went from town to town in Ephraim and Manasseh all the way to Zebulun, but they were laughed at and made fun of. Even so, some people from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun were submissive and came to Jerusalem. Moreover, God's power was at work in Judah, unifying them to do what the king and his officials had ordered by the Lord's commands. And if you jump to chapter 31, verse 1. When all these things were finished, all of the Israelites who were present went out of the cities of Judah, smashed the sacred pillars, cut down the sacred poles, and completely destroyed the shrines and altars throughout Judah, as well as Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Then all the Israelites returned to their individuals' home and their own cities. So they go out and they destroy all these other gods' things. And then they go home, and it seems like Hezekiah has done a real good job of getting at least this chunk of Israelites to remember the connection they have to God, the commandments that God has given to them, and maybe they'll get a chance to live in harmony with God again. But it doesn't last. Another king comes, that king leads the Israelites further away, and they forget this reform that Hezekiah leads, and this trend continues. So Hezekiah rules, Manasseh rules after him, and we're introduced to Manasseh in chapter 33, and I just love this opening line to his kingship. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 55 years in Jerusalem. 12-year-old is king. That's a hard gig. He doesn't really know what's going on, but here he is. He's the king of Jerusalem. Second verse, he did what was evil in the Lord's eyes, imitating the detestable practices of the nations that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the shrines that his father Hezekiah had destroyed, set up altars for the Baals, and made sacred poles. He bowed down to all the stars in the sky and worshipped them. He even built altars in the Lord's temple, the very place the Lord is speaking about when he said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." Manasseh built altars for all the stars in the sky in both courtyards of the Lord's temple. He burned his own sons alive in the Ben Hinnom Valley, consulted sign readers, fortune tellers, and sorcerers, and used mediums and diviners. He did much evil in the Lord's eyes and made him angry. So the son of the king who had kind of indicated some hope for the Israelites immediately does everything wrong in the book. He basically takes the list of do not do's and does them all. So very quickly, again, we see the ability of the Israelites to just quickly forget this God who is trying to be in a relationship with them and wants to live in harmony with them and walk away. So the decline continues. We get more kings that come over. Josiah becomes king, and he tries to do what Hezekiah does, and you can see that in chapter 35. He tries again, but it doesn't work. Chapter 36, another king takes place, and he's bad. 3 kings rule in chapter 36. And then we get to chapter 36, verse 11, and we're introduced to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the Lord his God's eyes and didn't submit before the prophet Jeremiah, who spoke for the Lord. Moreover, he rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, despite the solemn pledge Nebuchadnezzar had forced him to swear in God's name. He became stubborn and refused to turn back to the Lord, Israel's God. All the leaders of the priests and the people also grew increasingly unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations. They polluted the Lord's temple that God had dedicated in Jerusalem. Time and time again, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and his dwelling. But they made fun of God's messengers, treating God's words with contempt and ridiculing God's prophets to such an extent that there was no hope of warding off the Lord's rising anger against his people. So God brought the Babylonian king against them. The king killed their young men with the sword in their temple sanctuary and showed no pity for young men or for virgins, for the old or for the feeble. God handed all of them over to them. Then the king hauled everything off to Babylon, every item from God's temple, both large and small, including the treasures of the Lord's temple and those of the king and his officials. Next, the Babylonians burned God's temple down, demolished the walls of Jerusalem, and set fire to all its palaces, destroying everything of value. Finally, he exiled to Babylon anyone who survived the killing, so that they could be his slaves and the slaves of his children, until Persia came down to power. This is how the Lord's word spoken by Jeremiah was carried out. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest. For as long as it lay empty, it rested, until 70 years were completed. And then, the story ends here. Chapter 36, verse 22. Cyrus's decree is the heading in my Bible. In the first year of Persia's King Cyrus, to carry out the Lord's promise spoken through Jeremiah, the Lord moved Persia's King Cyrus to issue the following proclamation throughout his kingdom, along with a written decree. This is what Persia's King Cyrus says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the earth kingdoms and has instructed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Whoever among you belong to God's people, let them go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. And so, the story concludes. And again, the author is indicating to us that he knows the history of the Israelite people, at least up to this point and through the Babylonian exile. We don't get any details about the Babylonian exile, but we see this final depraved fall. Right? It says, this time not just the king was disobeying and kind of rejecting God wholesale, but the priesthood had rejected God and allowed false prophets and false gods into the temple. The people had abandoned God and were worshiping false gods. And so the Babylonians come in and they wipe them out and they burn down the temple and they take the Israelites back to Babylon. And that's not an unusually cruel practice in the ancient world. When you conquered a place, you got their people. They became your slaves, you took them home, they built your things and served your people. This is kind of normal practice in the ancient world. But then, King Cyrus comes to power. King Cyrus comes from Persia, which starts in modern-day Iran, and King Cyrus takes Persia and just pushes it across the entire ancient world. King Cyrus, historically, was really good at kind of forceful diplomacy, what Teddy Roosevelt would call gunboat diplomacy. He would march up to a town and he'd walk in and pull out a PowerPoint and tell the king of the local territory how awesome it was to be part of the Persian Empire. Talked about we built roads, and we have technology, and schools, and education systems, and if you join me, we're going to have a great relationship together. You could be a part of something, I'll protect you from everybody else, and we can really have a nice relationship. You'll be a governor, and still have some power, but I'm king. And if you want to say no, I have my huge army parked outside of your town and will destroy you. Right? So Cyrus is able to very quickly conquer lots of territory, including Babylon. He rolls in from the east, conquers Babylon, and we're told in the end that he frees the Jews from their captivity and lets them go back home. And the end of Chronicles is really open-ended. Look back at that last sentence. Whomever among you belong to God's people, let them go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. And originally, because Chronicles is at the end of the Jewish scriptures, that's how the whole thing ends. Let the Lord their God be with them. So what's the point of this recap book? Why is it written? Why are people reading it? Why does it still matter today? Because for people who had lost hope that God was with them and that the Messiah would come, it was a reminder of this story of God trying to build a relationship with people, his people continuously disobeying and abandoning him, and then in the end, him still moving in Cyrus to free his people to go back home and try again. So what we're seeing consistently through the Old Testament is this story of this choice that God's people have, to obey or to disobey. And that doesn't mean that God gives each of us a list of things that we have to do, and if we do them, we're good, and if we don't do them, we're not. But God sets out these expectations and these standards, and really at the core of them, as Moses reminds us, is to love God and love each other. Remember, as Moses is dying and talking to this last generation of Israelites, he says, you're going to screw up a lot, but if you can remember this, to love God and love each other, you're going to be okay. If you want to obey, that's the big one. Love God. But continuously in the Old Testament, the Israelites say, rather not. I'm not going to love God. I'm going to love things. I'm going to love money. I'm going to love other gods. I'm going to love power. I'm going to love territory. I'm going to love everything that God tells me not to. But God doesn't give up on them. Even after Israel is destroyed and the temple is burned down and 77 years pass, God moves, gives the Israelites a second chance. And the hope of the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is that reminder that God does not give up on his people is powerful enough to keep them waiting for the Messiah, powerful enough to keep them faithful to God, powerful enough to give them the hope that a better future will be on the horizon. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles feels out of place and it feels weird where it's stuck in the Bible, but the theology, when understood in the context of who it's written for and what it means to them and still to us today, makes it a really special and powerful book. I'm over time. Any questions before we wrap up? Okay, I'll see you next Wednesday.
Austin, how many more of these do you have?
Well, that many more? I'll double check the calendar. I think we meet through the second week of May. That might be enough time for us to get through most of the Old Testament. And so we'll look at maybe in the fall semester doing the New Testament side of things, or just picking up wherever this is left off and keeping it going. I don't want to leave you guys with any cliffhangers. We'll take the summer off and then figure out where we're at in the fall and keep going.
Okay,
I'm in it for the long haul if you are.
all right.